The Galactic Federation begged for help, paralyzed by fear as the brutal Kraxthul slaughtered their worlds, but only humans had the guts to stand against the alien butchers. Captain James Mitchell slammed his fist on the console. The distress call from Ambassador Ziloth rang in his ears. Kraxthul warships were burning world after world, and the spineless Federation sat wringing their hands. Ziloth whimpered that their pacifist ways left them helpless. Cowards. James opened a channel to UES Command. Admiral Vance, the Kraxthul are on a rampage. Permission to intercept with the First Fleet. The old man frowned. Engage them, and they may turn their guns on Earth next. The risk is high. And if we do nothing, sir, they'll reach us anyway after they finish mopping up the Federation. Vance sighed heavily. Very well, the fleet is yours. Give 'em hell, James, and Godspeed. James saluted. One way or another, this fight was coming to humanity. Better to face the enemy head-on than wait for them to show up on his doorstep. He just prayed human courage would be enough. James stared at the flickering displays with mounting dread. As the UES First Fleet dropped out of FTL at the edge of the Keldari system, long-range scans painted a grim picture. A massive Kraxthul armada swarmed over the lush garden world of Keldari Prime like angry hornets. James magnified the imagery, and his stomach turned. Dozens of cruel, jagged Kraxthul dreadnoughts pummeled the planet from high orbit, their monstrous plasma cannons boiling away azure oceans and igniting the once pristine atmosphere into a hellish conflagration. "Dear God," James whispered, "it's a massacre." Keldari Prime's feeble defense fleet was scattered and burning, swarmed by clouds of vicious Kraxthul attack craft. Ugly, boxy fighters and light cruisers tore into their crumbling formations like wolves savaging a wounded elk. James could see clusters of desperate life pods spilling from shattered Federation ships, only to be mercilessly harvested by precision strikes. The Kraxthul didn't take prisoners. They never left survivors. "Sir, enemy fleet numbers at least 200 capital ships with fighter screens in the thousands," James's sensor officer reported, fighting to keep his voice steady, assessing a 5-1 numerical advantage, at minimum. James nodded grimly. He opened a fleet-wide comms channel with a gesture. "This is it, people. You all knew the odds when you signed up. Time to earn our pay." He studied the tactical holomap, an idea forming. "We hit them from the flank, hard and fast. Drive for that cluster of dreadnoughts bombarding the planet. If we can knock out their C&C ships, maybe we can throw them into disarray, buy time for planetary evacuations." Acknowledgement lights winked green. Humans didn't flinch from impossible fights. James clenched his jaw. "Weapons free, all ships, full attack." The human fleet accelerated to combat speed in tight formation, racing to flank the Kraxthul horde. James targeted a trio of enemy cruisers, screening the dreadnoughts. "Ripple fire. Full missile spreads on designated targets. Launch on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark!" The human ships belched smoke and flame as a tsunami of plasma warheads erupted from their VLS cells. Hundreds of shield-seeking missiles bore down on the Kraxthul pickets, a swarm of burning stars against the void. Point defense lasers lashed out frantically, spearing docents from the black, but it wasn't enough. Over 100 warheads found their mark, slamming into the Kraxthul cruisers in rippling chains of Sunbright detonations. Ugly rents and craters blossomed across the cruisers' hulls as their shields buckled and failed beneath the onslaught. Atmosphere and molten debris gouted into space. One cruiser snapped in half like a rotten twig, secondary explosions ripping it to pieces. The other two reeled away, trailing smoke and ruin, their flanks collapsing into tangled wreckage. "Hit them again," James roared. "Burn a path to those dreadnoughts." The human ships clawed past the shattered pickets and plunged into the heart of the Kraxthul fleet. The aliens reeled at the sheer ferocity of the human assault, shocked by their outsized losses. Then the huge Kraxthul armada began to ponderously wheel about to face the humans head-on. Hailstorms of vicious red plasma bolts hammered out at the human fleet as the alien ships rallied. James threw his ships into evasive zigzag patterns, struggling to slip the worst of the storm. The small, nimble human vessels danced madly among colossal blasts that could atomize a ship in one hit. Still, the sheer volume of fire was overwhelming. A destroyer erupted into an eye-searing fireball to port as a lucky plasma bolt found its magazine. A frigate spun away, venting fire and bodies, its command deck sheared away. The battlefield dissolved into a chaotic maelstrom of darting ships, strobing explosions, and lethal crisscrossing plasma beams. The human fleet punched deeper towards the bombarding dreadnoughts, throwing every missile and rail slug they had into the Kraxthul battle line. Alien hulls shattered and burned under the desperate human assault. James gritted his teeth as the flagship shuddered around him, straining to break through. "We've almost breached their perimeter. Keep pushing forward." Sudden hammer blows rocked the flagship, staggering James in his combat harness. The lighting failed and damage alarms screamed. "Sir," the sensor tech cried out, "Kraxthul boarding pods just punched through the fore armor. They're in the ship." "Seal all bulkheads," James snapped. He broke open the nearest emergency locker and snatched up a plasma rifle and bandolier of power cells. "Security teams, repel boarders, all hands, prepare to engage in close quarters." He turned to the bridge officers and tossed out rifles and cells. "Lock down your stations and get armed. We hold the bridge at all costs." Inhuman roars and the bark of human weapons echoed through the ship's corridors outside the sealed bridge hatch. James crouched behind a sparking comp station and racked the slide of his rifle. There was a resounding boom, and the hatch shuddered in its frame. Another boom, and the hatch crumpled half off its hinges. Then it burst inwards completely, and hulking reptilian shapes stormed through the smoke. The Kraxthul boarders were enormous brutes, their bodies studded with cybernetic enhancements and stimulant injectors. Blank, compound eyes glittered with murderous frenzy in their armored skulls. Drool slobbered from tooth-crowded muzzles. They carried huge, brutal plasma cleavers and barbed kinetic guns, living engines of slaughter unleashed to secure the ship. James raised his rifle to his shoulder and centered the lead target in his reflex sights. "Open fire!" He pulled the trigger, and the world dissolved into the dark thunder of combat. James's shot drilled the lead brute right between its mad eyes, blasting its skull into bony shards and boiling brains. It flopped onto its back, limbs spasming. The other Kraxthul threw themselves to the sides of the hatchway, seeking cover. Searing plasma bolts ripped back and forth as the bridge crew poured on disciplined fire, fighting to keep the boarders bottled up in the choke point. One Kraxthul rose up with a roar, hosing the human positions with a storm of flesh-shredding flechettes. Consoles exploded, and a rating went down screaming as the vicious rounds found their mark. Then a grenade from the tactical officer silenced the beast in a thundering blast of fire and whirring shrapnel. James and his officers leapfrogged positions, covering each other as they slapped in fresh power cells. Kraxthul bodies piled in the hatchway, but more and more kept pouring through. One lunged through the barricade, swinging its plasma cleaver in lethal orange arcs. It slammed the heavy, superheated blade down on a gunner's station, slicing the comp station in half and nearly gutting the gunner, who rolled away by a hair. James dumped his rifle into the creature's side, burning 4 fist-sized holes through its armored torso. It howled and staggered, but kept coming, swinging the cleaver at his head. He ducked the decapitating stroke and snatched his fighting knife from his boot sheath. The blade was a monomolecular stiletto, diamond-edged and savagely sharp. James slammed his empty rifle into its snarling jaws, snapping the beast's head back. Then he lunged inside its reach and rammed the stiletto hilt deep into its throat, stabbing again and again. The Kraxthul gargled and thrashed, clawing at him with its free hand. Then it toppled backwards off the knife in a spray of ichor. "Aft deck reports the Kraxthul are pulling back," an officer shouted. "They're falling back to their pods." James risked a glance at the TAC display and saw the Kraxthul fleet was starting to disengage and flee the system. Their commander must have realized his fleet was overextended and outflanked, even with superior numbers. The dreadnoughts lurched away from the planet and began to accelerate for FTL translation points. Before James could issue a pursuit order, The dreadnoughts fired a final spiteful salvo, hammering Keldari Prime with all their remaining missiles and plasma reserves. Huge continents burned. The cities were charnel houses. Retreat missiles arced away into the void, no doubt crammed with plundered riches and planetary resources. Then the Kraxthul fleet leapt for FTL and vanished, leaving Keldari Prime broken and burning behind them. "Stand down from battle stations!" James croaked through a ragged throat. He stared at the bodies littering his bridge, the smashed stations, the scorch marks seared into the bulkheads. Similar scenes would be playing out across the battered, bloody ships of his fleet. They had won, but the price was hideous. "Get me a fleet casualty and damage report ASAP," James said heavily. He closed his eyes against the pain of the ragged holes ripped in his ranks. The UES had bloodied the Kraxthul noses and sent them running, but this was a grim taste of the slaughter to come. James vowed to himself that he would avenge every one of the fallen. The Kraxthul wouldn't get away with this brutality, not while he still drew breath. Humanity would never stop until the Kraxthul answered for their atrocities, no matter the cost. James stalked through the airlock onto the Federation flagship, his boots striking like hammers on the deck. Fury burned in his gut. Fury at the senseless deaths of his crew. Fury at the cowardice of the aliens who should have been humanity's allies. He found Ambassador Xyloth on the bridge, the willowy grey alien wringing his long-fingered hands as he watched James approach. "Captain Mitchell, I cannot express the depths of our gratitude." "Stow it," James snarled. He jabbed a finger at the alien's narrow chest. "Hundreds of humans died today fighting your war, while you and the rest of your spineless Federation friends cowered behind your borders." Xyloth's large black eyes shimmered with sorrow. "Please understand, Captain. We have evolved beyond the savagery of warfare. Our ships are not equipped for combat. We are explorers, diplomats." "And where has that gotten you?" James demanded. "Waiting to be slaughtered by the Kraxthul like lambs? Did you even try to communicate with them before they started razing your worlds?" The ambassador looked away. "The Kraxthul, their reputation for cruelty, for xenocide, we calculated that any attempt at contact would only provoke them to terrible retribution." James laughed bitterly. "So you hid, buried your heads in the sand and hoped the monsters would pass you by?" He shook his head in disgust. "That ends now. The human fleet will continue to engage the Kraxthul, but we do it on our terms, not yours. We'll shield you from the consequences of your own gutless inaction, but don't expect us to die for you again." He turned on his heel and stormed back to the airlock, leaving the ambassador to his shame. Safely back on the bridge of his battered flagship, James slumped into his command chair, exhaustion dragging at him. The last 24 hours caught up to him all at once. The desperate charge against the Kraxthul line, the chaotic shudder of railguns and missile launches, the stink of melted plastic and flesh as the alien boarders breached the pressure doors. "Sir?" A gentle voice cut into his dark reverie. Commander Sarah Lee, his science officer, stood at his elbow. Even haggard with fatigue and grief, her fine-boned features still managed to brighten the smoky bridge. "I've been analyzing the scanner data from the battle. I noticed something interesting about the energy signature of the Kraxthul ships." James scrubbed a hand over his face, trying to marshal his scattered thoughts. "Show me." Lee called up a holographic plot, the math scrawling through the air in fuzzy blue lines. "Here and here, see those fluctuations? They're like nothing I've seen before. If I had to guess, I'd say the Kraxthul are using some sort of dark energy matrix to power their ships and weapons. The implications are—" She trailed off, shaking her head in grudging wonder. James studied the energy spikes, an idea tickling the back of his brain. If we could capture one of their ships intact, figure out how that dark energy tech works. "We might just be able to replicate it," Lee finished, her eyes gleaming. "It would give us an edge, maybe even turn the tide." James called up a star chart, scanning the nearby systems. There on the edge of Kraxthul space, a small but heavily guarded supply depot funneling resources to the front lines, ripe for the picking if they played their cards right. He straightened in his chair, a predatory light in his eyes. He flicked on the fleet-wide comm channel. "All hands, this is the captain. Set condition 1 throughout the ship. We have a new mission." If the aliens wouldn't fight this war, then humanity would just have to do what it did best: adapt, innovate, and unleash hell on their enemies. The Kraxthul were about to learn what it meant to be on the wrong side of human ingenuity and desperation. The UES fleet dropped out of FTL on the fringes of the Kraxthul supply depot, engines thrumming with barely restrained power. James gripped the arms of his command chair, adrenaline already surging through his veins. "Target sighted," his sensor officer reported, fingers flying over her console. "Lone Kraxthul dreadnought tethered to the asteroid base. Looks like they're in the middle of resupply." James allowed himself a tight, predatory grin. The alien behemoth floated in space, umbilical tethers snaking out to anchor it to the hollowed-out asteroid. Swarms of smaller craft flitted around it like worker bees, ferrying crates of ordnance and unidentifiable cargo. The dreadnought's running lights pulsed softly, its crew oblivious to the ambush that was about to slam down on their heads. "They're not getting away this time," James growled. He punched the ship-wide comm. "All hands, battle stations, prepare to repel boarders." Terse acknowledgements rippled back as the crew scrambled to their posts. The clang of boots on metal decks and the hiss of ceiling pressure doors echoed through the ship. James turned to the tactical hologram, studying the insectoid hull of the Kraxthul dreadnought. "There," he said, stabbing a finger at a puckered indent on the ship's flank. "That's got to be a primary access point. We'll breach there, fight our way to the engine room, and secure the dark energy core. The second we engage, they'll try to pull away and bring that monster's guns to bear," his XO warned, a deep furrow between his brows. "We won't last long against a capital ship." "Then we'll just have to strike hard and fast," James replied, baring his teeth. "Gut them before they know what hit them." He opened the comm to the strike team mustering in the launch bay. Rows of grim-faced Marines stood at attention, bristling with an arsenal of plasma rifles, incendiary grenades, and brutally efficient vibroblades. At their head, armored head to toe in black impact gel, was Commander Sarah Lee. "Commander," James said, "you'll lead the boarding action. Get in, secure the dark energy core, and download every scrap of data you can from their computers." "Understood, sir," Lee replied, smacking a fresh energy cell into her rifle. Her face was a mask of determination beneath her transparent faceplate. "We'll crack them open like a rotten egg." "Give 'em hell, Marines," James said. "The Kraxthul are about to find out what it means to have humanity knocking on their front door." He cut the comm and turned back to the tactical display, his eyes hard. "Helmsman, give me a full burn towards that supply depot. Let's get in close before they spot us. Comms, start jamming their transmissions on my mark." The human ships knifed towards the unsuspecting dreadnought, the bone white of their hulls barely visible against the starscape. James clenched his fist, a fierce pride in his crew, in his species, surging through him. This wasn't just a raid, it was a reckoning. A message written in fire and blood to an enemy that had sown only destruction. "Marking," he snapped. The comms officer hammered his console, and a flood of electronic noise blasted across every frequency. The Kraxthul comm chatter dissolved into panicked shrieks and guttural bellows. "They've seen us," the sensor officer yelled. James slammed his hand down on the weapons control. "All ships, open fire. Give 'em everything you've got." The human ships shuddered as every railgun, laser battery, and missile tube discharged in a single devastating salvo. The void lit up with the fury of their onslaught, space itself seeming to buckle and twist under the sheer weight of their firepower. Relativistic slugs, wreathed in incandescent plasma, tore through the flimsy hulls of the swarming support craft, ripping them to shreds in gouts of atmosphere and spinning debris. Lances of blinding energy slashed out at the dreadnought's hull, boiling through layers of ablative armor and exposing the vulnerable superstructure beneath. Missile contrails stitched glittering spiderwebs across the starscape, peppering the behemoth with rippling chains of explosions. The Kraxthul ship shuddered under the hammer blows of the human assault, its defensive batteries struggling to return fire. Sizzling beams of plasma clawed out at the human fleet, trying to pick off their darting frigates and destroyers. "That's our cue," James barked into the strike team's channel. "Commander Lee, you are clear to launch. Get your people onto that ship and secure the target." "Aye, aye, sir," Lee responded, the steely clank of the Marines' armored boots ringing through the calm. "We'll get it done." James watched on the tactical display as the powerful wedge of the strike team's boarding craft launched from the flagship's belly hangar. It arrowed towards the stricken dreadnought, the alien point defense guns swiveling frantically to track it. Strobing explosions and searing energy beams filled the space around the charging pinnace as the human ships intensified their barrage, trying to cover the Marines' approach. Just meters from the dreadnought's hull, the craft shuddered and the rear hatch blew open, disgorging the strike team into the void like a swarm of angry hornets. The armored figures of the Marines swarmed over the pitted surface of the ship, mag-locked boots clanging as they sprinted for the breach in the hull. James clenched his teeth as he watched them pour into the gash, weapons spitting fire as they engaged the Kragsthoul inside. Guttural alien roars and the bark of human rifles echoed over the comm as a ferocious firefight erupted in the ship's corridors. "First squad, secure the portside junction," Lee snapped over the cacophony of battle. "Third and fourth, flank the core chamber. Watch those corners." James's heart pounded as he listened to the desperate clash playing out on the other side of the hull. The cold equations of war tumbled through his head, so many of his people throwing themselves into the teeth of the enemy, all on his orders. It was a weight he would carry forever, no matter the outcome. "We've reached the core," Lee suddenly shouted, her words nearly lost in a hail of plasma fire. "Cover me, I'm going to try to access their systems." Her armor cam flickered to life on the secondary display, painting a scene of utter chaos. The strike team crouched behind jagged barricades of twisted metal, pouring fire down the corridor at the massing Kragsthoul. In the center of the chamber, suspended in a spiderweb of crackling energy beams, was a pulsating sphere of seething darkness. It seemed to swallow the light around it, pulling the very fabric of reality into its swirling depths. Commander Lee broke from cover and sprinted to the glowing control podium beneath the core, her team laying down a withering, suppressing fire. She slapped a data probe onto the alien console and started hammering at the controls. The podium's holoprojector flickered and spat, the Kragsthoul computers struggling to interface with Lee's algorithms. Come on, James heard her mutter as she worked furiously to breach the ship's database. "Let me in, you alien piece of sh—" Suddenly, a warbling klaxon blared through the strike team's comms. The Kragsthoul characters on the console screen flashed an angry red. "Sir," Lee screamed, "I think I triggered some kind of failsafe. The core is—" Before she could finish, a deep, shuddering groan echoed through the dreadnought's hull. On the vis display, the walls of the core chamber began to ripple and buckle, the metal flexing like a living thing. The dark energy sphere blazed with a sickly light, writhing tendrils of blackness lashing out from its surface. "Everyone out," James roared. "Abort the mission. Get back to the ship." The strike team needed no further encouragement. They turned and sprinted for the breach, bounding over the scattered Kragsthoul corpses in their haste to escape. Behind them, the dreadnought shook and heaved as if gripped by a seizure, the dark energy core pulsing faster and faster. James could only watch helplessly as his people fled for their lives. The last armored figure to reach the extraction point was Commander Lee, laying down a final searing barrage to cover the retreat. Just as she coiled to leap through the jagged rent in the hull, a crackling plasma blast caught her square in the back, shattering her armor and sending her tumbling. "Sarah," James cried, forgetting protocol in his horrified shock. But Commander Lee was already moving, half rolling, half crawling the final few meters to the breach. She kicked out savagely behind her, catching the charging Kragsthoul warrior in the face with a boot as it lunged for her. Then she flung herself into the void, flailing for a desperate handhold on the waiting Marine shuttle. "All units disengage immediately," James ordered. He watched the shuttle latch onto the hull of the flagship, disgorging the gasping remnants of the strike team into the airlock. Behind them, the Kraxthul vessel flared like the heart of a dying star. The hull peeled itself apart, the gleaming metallic plates crumpled and distorted like paper in a flame. Then, in a final cataclysmic blast, the ship core ruptured. A blinding surge of light and a wall of debris washed across the human ships as the dreadnought detonated. Metal splinters and globules of liquefied hull pinged off the flagship's armor, the entire vessel shuddering violently. When the glare and the static cleared from the viewports and instruments, there was nothing left of the Kraxthul behemoth but an expanding cloud of dust and energetic particles. James sagged in his restraints, the tension draining from his body. He slapped the comm panel with a shaking hand. "Commander Lee, report. What's your status?" He heard a ragged exhalation, a hiss of pain. "We're all right, sir." Lee's voice came back, rougher than usual. "A bit banged up, but we'll live. Recommend quarantine protocols until we can get decontaminated and checked out by medical." James winced in sympathy. "Acknowledged, Commander. And the data? Did you manage to get anything?" There was a long pause, then, "I got something, sir. Had to pull the plug before the download finished, but there's definitely some intel here we can use. Tech specs, fleet dispositions. It's not much, but it's a start." James closed his eyes, exhaling a silent prayer of thanks to the uncaring universe. He glanced at the tactical holo, taking in the scattered wrecks of the support ships, the scorched and pitted hull of his flagship, the ragged hole in his formation where one of his frigates had been boiled away by a lucky plasma volley. All of it a small price to pay, if there was even a chance of ending this war. "You and your team did well, Sarah. Damned well. We'll make sure this data gets into the right hands." He swallowed hard. "Get some rest. Get patched up. You've earned it." "Aye, aye, sir," Lee replied, her voice already firming up. "We'll be ready when you need us." James cut the comm and turned to his bridge crew, his gaze fierce with resolve. "Well, you heard her. We hurt them today, showed them what human ingenuity and guts can do." He gestured to the cloud of debris that had been a Kraxthul warship mere moments ago. "That's just a taste, a little preview of what's coming for them. The Kraxthul want a war." He smiled coldly. "We'll give them a goddamned war." James lay in the medbay, gritting his teeth as the ship's doctor applied salve to the plasma burns scoring his back. The sickly sweet stench of charred flesh and antiseptic stung his nostrils. Every nerve ending screamed as the doctor scraped away dead skin and pumped him full of antibiotics and painkillers. The hatch hissed open, and Commander Lee strode in, her face alight with barely contained excitement. James waved off the doctor and pushed himself upright on the gurney, ignoring the lancing agony in his shoulders. "So what have you got for me, Sarah?" he asked, his voice rough with pain and exhaustion. Lee activated her data pad, and a holographic star chart bloomed to life above it. She jabbed a finger at a series of pulsing red dots scattered across the galaxy. "I finished analyzing the data we pulled from the Kraxthul ship, sir. It looks like they're drawing their dark energy from these structures, for lack of a better term. Absolutely massive constructs light years across, and old, as in millions of years predating any known civilization." James narrowed his eyes, studying the shimmering points of light. So the Kraxthul found a ready-made power grid just waiting to be exploited. Must have jump-started their whole damn empire. "That's what it looks like," Lee agreed. She zoomed in on one of the megastructures, the hollow resolving into a tangled knot of impossible geometry that made James's eyes water. "If we could take control of even one of these things, cut the Kraxthul off from their energy supply." "We could bring them to their knees," James finished, a savage grin splitting his face. "Hit them where it really hurts." Lee nodded, her own smile razor-edged. "Exactly, sir. I've already started running the numbers on what kind of fleet we'd need to assault one of these structures. It won't be easy, but—" She was interrupted by a harsh buzzing from the comm panel on the wall. James jerked his chin at it. "See who it is." Lee punched the accept key, and Ambassador Xyloth's gaunt face flickered to life on the screen. The alien's normally serene features were drawn and haggard, his liquid black eyes haunted. "Captain Mitchell," he said, his voice a reedy rasp, "I have grave news. The Kraxthul have unleashed a wave of unspeakable atrocities on the worlds they've conquered, entire cities put to the torch, millions enslaved or processed for consumption." Xyloth visibly fought down a shudder of revulsion. "The Federation is begging you. Send your peacekeepers to protect us. Establish safe zones for the innocent. Humanity is our only hope." James felt a dull, distant pang of pity for the ravaged aliens, but it was drowned out by the cold, implacable voice of necessity. He'd sacrificed too much, watched too many friends die, choking on their own blood, to be dragged into another pointless massacre. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Ambassador," he said flatly. "Every human soldier under my command is needed on the front lines. We can't spare anyone for guard duty." Xyloth recoiled as if slapped. "But Captain, surely you must see that—" "What I see," James cut him off, each word sharp as a razor, "is a species that hid behind its principles while the enemy burned its way across the stars. You had every chance to prepare for this war, and you squandered it. I will not let humanity pay for your cowardice." He stabbed a finger at the comm panel, and Xyloth's pleading face vanished, replaced by blessed silence. Lee cleared her throat awkwardly. "Sir, I know it's not my place, but he's not wrong. What the Kraxthul are doing to those people—" James closed his eyes, sucking in a slow, steadying breath. When he opened them again, they were hard as flint. "I know, Sarah, believe me, I know. But look at the big picture. We cripple the Kraxthul's power supply, we end this war. That's the only way we save lives in the long run. Anything else is just a band-aid on a sucking chest wound." He jabbed a finger at the hollow of the alien megastructure still floating above Lee's datapad. "That's our target. That's how we finish this. Gather the senior staff and have them meet me in the briefing room in 1 hour. It's time to plan our assault." Lee snapped a crisp salute. "Aye, aye, sir. I'll get the ball rolling on fleet logistics. We're going to need every ship we can beg, borrow or steal for this one." "See that we get them," James said as he levered himself off the gurney, fighting down a grimace as his abused muscles screamed in protest. "I'll handle the call to UES Command. With any luck, they'll see the wisdom in pressing the offensive." Lee shot him a worried glance. "You sure you're up for this, sir? That burn needs time to heal." James waved off her concern. "I'll rest when I'm dead, Commander. The Kraxthul sure as hell won't wait for me to take a nap." He straightened his uniform jacket with a wince and strode towards the hatch, his bootsteps ringing on the deck. There was a war to win, and he'd be damned if he'd let a few third-degree burns slow him down. James glared at the grizzled face of Admiral Vance on the viewscreen, trying to keep a lid on his simmering frustration. The old man was droning on about fleet logistics and overextended supply lines, his every word oozing caution and reserve. "Our latest intel puts Kraxthul raiding parties dangerously close to Sol Sector," Vance said, jabbing a finger at something off-screen. "If they push any deeper, they could threaten Earth itself. I'm not sure we can protect the homeworld and still maintain your expeditionary force at its current strength." James leaned forward in his chair, fixing Vance with a piercing stare. "All the more reason to press the attack now, sir. We have a chance to end this war in a single decisive stroke. The Kraxthul megastructure is the key. Once we control it, we cut off their energy supply at the source." Vance frowned, deep lines etching into his weathered face. "That's a hell of a gamble, Captain. You'd be taking your fleet into the heart of enemy territory with no guarantee of success. If the Kraxthul manage to surround you—" "It's a risk we have to take," James insisted, an edge of desperation creeping into his voice. "We can't win this war by fighting defensively. Sooner or later, they'll roll over us through sheer attrition." He jabbed a finger at the glowing holomap of the galaxy floating above the briefing table. "This is our chance, Admiral. Our one shot to hit them where they're vulnerable. I'm asking you to trust me." There was a long, pregnant pause. James could practically hear the gears turning in Vance's head as he weighed the cold calculus of war. Finally, the old man let out a heavy sigh. "Very well, Captain. I'll give you the go-ahead. But I want it on record that I think this is a mistake. You'll be operating without support at the very limit of your range. If anything goes wrong, I'll bear full responsibility, James said firmly. This is my call, sir, mine and my crew's. Vance gave a curt nod. Then good hunting, Captain, and Godspeed. Vance out. The view screen winked out, and James slumped back in his chair, suddenly feeling every ache and pain in his battered body. He scrubbed a hand over his face, trying to banish the fog of fatigue. A gentle hand landed on his shoulder, and he glanced up to see Commander Lee standing over him, her brow creased with worry. "Are you sure about this, James?" she asked softly, all pretense of formality evaporating in the face of her concern. "Vance is right. We'll be on our own out there. If the Cracksthul catch wind of our plan—" James reached up and covered her hand with his own, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I'm sure, Sarah, this is the only way. We have to end this war before there's nothing left to save." He pushed himself to his feet and faced his senior staff, injecting steel into his voice. "We all knew the risks when we signed up to defend the Federation. This is what we trained for. This is why we're here." He raised a fist in the air, his eyes blazing with determination. "So I ask you one more time, who's with me? Who's ready to strike back at those alien bastards and make them regret the day they ever heard the name humanity?" For a moment there was silence. Then, as one, the men and women of the UES First Fleet surged to their feet, thrusting their fists in the air. Their voices rose in a ragged cheer that echoed off the bulkheads. "We're with you, sir," Lieutenant Takeshi, his weapons officer, shouted. "To the gates of hell, if that's what it takes." "Cracksthul won't know what hit 'em," Chief Engineer Mackenzie growled, slamming a meaty fist into his palm. "Let's show 'em what human ingenuity can do." James felt a fierce surge of pride as he looked out at his crew, their determination and courage etched into every face. These were the best men and women Earth had to offer, and he'd gladly go into battle with any of them at his side. "Tie your stations," he barked. "Begin jump prep and ready weapons. We're going in hard and fast. It's time to teach the Cracksthul to fear humanity's name." As his crew scrambled to obey, James turned to the fore viewport, staring out at the sea of stars. Somewhere out there, the Cracksthul megastructure waited, the key to victory, or the instrument of their destruction. But as he felt the deck plates thrum beneath his feet, as he heard the familiar roar of the engines spooling up for FTL, James felt nothing but a grim sense of resolve. "All right, you alien sons of bitches," he muttered under his breath. "Let's dance." The UES First Fleet burst out of warp speed on the fringes of the Cracksthul megastructure, weapons primed and shields at maximum. James gripped the arms of his command chair as the impossibly vast structure filled the view screen. A twisted latticework of dark metal shot through with pulsing crimson lines. "Reading multiple Cracksthul signatures," Lieutenant Takeshi barked, his eyes locked on the sensor display. "Dreadnoughts, heavy cruisers, fighter screens, they're coming out to greet us." James saw them, the jagged shapes of alien warships gliding out from the megastructure's docking bays like angry hornets from a nest. Their hulls bristled with vicious spines and barbed protrusions, their weapons arrays swiveling to lock onto the human interlopers. "All ships engage at will," James ordered, his voice booming across the fleet comm. "Fighters, screen the capital ships. Bombers, target those docking bays. Let's keep the bastards bottled up inside their own house." The space around the megastructure erupted into a maelstrom of fire and fury as the two fleets collided. Lance beams and railgun slugs crisscrossed the void, impacting on shields in eye-searing flashes. Fighters darted and swirled like maddened insects, locked in deadly dances with their alien counterparts. James flinched as a plasma torpedo slammed into the flagship's forward shields, making the whole ship shudder. Damage alarms warbled and the lights flickered, but they held steady. "Forward batteries, target that dreadnought," he shouted, jabbing a finger at the massive Cracksthul ship spearheading the enemy formation. "Burn them down!" The UES Retribution's prow lit up with the hellish glow of her particle beam cannons, scourging into the dreadnought's shields. The Cracksthul ship shuddered under the onslaught but kept coming, its own weapons hammering back at the human flagship. "Shields at 50%, Commander Lee warned. her fingers flying over the damage control console. "We can't take much more of this." James gritted his teeth, his mind racing. The Kraxthul were fighting with a savage ferocity, throwing themselves at the human fleet with no regard for their own lives. They had to know what was at stake. They had to know that if the humans took the megastructure, it would be the beginning of the end for their empire. And that desperation made them all the more dangerous. "Helm, bring us about," James ordered. "Cut across their flank and target their engines. We'll take them apart piece by piece if we have to." The Retribution shuddered as her thrusters flared, swinging her around to rake the dreadnought's flanks with her broadside batteries. The alien ship's shields flickered and died under the onslaught, and hull plating shattered and spun away into the void. But even as the dreadnought reeled, more Kraxthul ships poured from the megastructure's launch bays, cruisers, frigates, fighters, a seemingly endless tide of reinforcements rushing to plug the gaps in their lines. James watched the tactical display with a sinking feeling in his gut. The Kraxthul were throwing everything they had at the human fleet, and his ships were taking a pounding. They had to break through soon, or there wouldn't be anything left of them to claim victory. "Signal the Yorktown and the Lexington," he shouted over the chaos of battle. "Tell them to form up on us. We're going to punch through their center and make a run for that primary docking bay." Acknowledgement lights winked as the two heavy cruisers pulled into formation on the Retribution's flanks. Their guns blazed as they cleared a path through the swarming Kraxthul ships, buying a momentary respite in the storm of fire. "All ahead full," James roared. "Damn the torpedoes and full speed ahead." The Retribution leapt forward, her engines howling as she strained to break the Kraxthul lines. The Yorktown and the Lexington clung to her flanks, pouring fire into any alien ship that tried to bar their path. James gripped his armrests until his knuckles whitened, his heart pounding in his ears. This was it, the moment of truth. If they could just reach that docking bay, establish a beachhead inside the megastructure itself. "Brace for impact!" Lee shouted, her voice cracking with strain. The Kraxthul dreadnought loomed before them, a wall of jagged metal and hatred. Its guns swiveled to point dead at the Retribution's prow, glowing with murderous energy. James opened his mouth to bark a command, but it was too late. The dreadnought fired, and the world dissolved into searing light and thunder. Consoles exploded, and crewmen screamed as the flagship's forward shields collapsed, letting the full fury of the Kraxthul weapons slash into her armor. James was hurled from his chair as the deck bucked beneath him. He hit the bulkhead with a bone-jarring thud. The breath blasted from his lungs. His vision swam and darkened at the edges, and he tasted blood on his tongue. Distantly, as if through a long tunnel, he heard Lee shouting damage reports. Breaches on decks 7 through 12. Life support failing. Weapons offline. The Yorktown gone, blasted to atoms by a lucky torpedo hit. The Lexington, crippled and spewing atmosphere, falling back with Kraxthul fighters swarming over her like piranhas frenziing on a bleeding whale. And the dreadnought, looming over them like an avenging god, its guns burning with the promise of annihilation. James struggled to his feet, his head pounding, his ribs screaming with every breath. He staggered to the shattered remains of the view screen, staring out at the Kraxthul ship as it prepared the killing blow. "Ramming speed," he croaked through bloody lips. "All power to engines." Lee stared at him in shock, her face ashen beneath her helmet. "Sir, what are you—" "Do it," James roared, slamming a fist on the bulkhead. "It's the only way." For a moment he thought she would argue, but then her jaw firmed and she nodded with grim acceptance. Her fingers danced over the helm console, and the Retribution groaned as her engines flared to life, driving her forward on a collision course. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support me, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel. And for every comment that says, "I liked the story," I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.